just to pertinent to today's topic, Sumit, I don't have a lot of insight into the M&A marketplace over, outside the US. It's more in the United States. So how does the merger space, is it heating up over there? Is it cooling down? Is it a big deal? Is it like mostly acquisitions of tech? Do you have any insights on that?
So it's a little bit of everything here, Lisa. And what I see is a lot of smaller firms have been getting absorbed by larger ones. So one of the common trends is that somebody starts up a tech firm and their sole objective is to make money by getting acquired.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a celebration, and it's like winning the lottery. When you get acquired by a larger firm, you cash in and you start something else. So that's one of the things I see. Interestingly, there also are Indian firms which are trying to grow their footprint overseas, and they've been acquiring firms in the US. So a couple of years ago, during my Deloitte days, I was actually doing cultural integration for an Indian company which had acquired two small US tech firms because they were trying to grow their footprint in North America. So they looked for complementary capabilities and they acquired those firms. Of course, there was more of an atmosphere of hesitation and nervousness around those because you're employed by a company in the US and suddenly you're reporting into somebody who's 3,000 miles away, multiple time zones off, and you don't really know how the culture is going to shape up. You don't really know what the future holds for you, whether your job will stay intact or not, and so on. And of course, there also are more merging of equals that's happening, where two companies with complementary skill sets, they decide to come together, present a stronger footprint to the market and to the world, and leverage some kind of cost advantages and also a unified go-to-market strategy. So in fact, interestingly, in the consulting space, a lot of that has happened over the last 4 years or so.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, that is interesting. That whole idea of acquiring companies outside your native country, that seems really, I mean, I know that goes on here too, but that seems like my world is culture. So I think about like you got now double the trouble, right? You got company culture, native culture, time zones. That's a real thing for sure. I worked on a project with Xerox many years ago when they were just really starting to transition into cloud-based technology. And there was a team that, and there was the company they had bought in Portland, Oregon. And of course they're in Rochester, New York. So right there, you had culture clash, kind of dynamics. And then they had a lot of what they were trying to do was revamp what the Portland people affectionately called Xerox's legacy spaghetti code. And so they had a team of people in India, and so now you're dealing with this, and this was back in 2011, I think. So the internet technology wasn't what it is today. It wasn't like you could just hop on Zoom, and everybody could just be in the same room together. It was this big deal to put anybody from across the ocean onto a true video feed. It was, and I guess today's technology makes it a little bit easier to kind of get, on the same page or build trust or whatever, but that's a challenge.
Yeah, it's true. It's a totally different world than it was 10 years ago. Absolutely. I did a presentation recently about how the digital environment has changed, the world of talent and pay forever, because of that aspect. I mean, we're looking at, and if you just look at the broadband speeds and how they've grown, and just in the past few years, that's enabled video technology. I mean, it's just incredible. Yeah.
How has that affected pay and benefits? I'm curious what that linkage looks like.
Yeah, so that's definitely an interesting conversation. So that it really has changed. It's created a digital nomad, and so this is a totally different pay group that's evolved. It used to be just like this little, everybody wanted to be a digital nomad and move around the world and live wherever they wanted to live, and just work remotely. And that was something that was kind of a dream for 5 years ago. And then and when the pandemic hit, then everybody just started doing it, And
That's
so,
why the real estate price where I live has gone so high. All these people from San Francisco, New York, moving to the mountains.
yeah, and there's a lot of people that are doing this on a global basis, and of course this causes, people are doing it, basically illegally, because you can't just work from anywhere without, paying your taxes and so forth. And so there's the countries are catching up and with their policies and on how to do immigration and or just labor and so forth when it comes to digital nomads.
That's an interesting point, actually. Sorry. So in Eastern Europe, Estonia, they've recently started a program called, so using that, you can actually become a digital citizen. So you can apply for citizenship. They don't really want you to give up the citizenship of your existing nation, but you can take citizenship of Estonia. You can become an Estonian citizen online, and you can set up a business there. And they've got tax exemptions, and they make it easier for you to approach the rest of Eastern and even Western Europe. So I'm not really sure if it existed before the pandemic. I think it might just be around that time, but definitely interesting. And before that, the concept of a digital nomad was somebody who's sitting on the beaches of Bali with a laptop in one hand and a glass of beer in the other, and doing some kind of freelance work. But I think it's evolved a lot since then, and the pandemic's really given it a major boost. And pretty much entire organizations have moved on to becoming digital nomads now.
Right. Yeah, I'm creating a pay structure for a digital nomad company right now. So it's
interesting.
It's fun, and new thoughts that are coming up all the time.
Right, so, about those boundaries of states and country lines.
Yeah, and this is a topic that we're going to talk on the People Strategy Forum in about 2 weeks. So it's going to be. I'm looking forward to that. But we are at the top of the hour, so we have to kick things off. So
okay.
We're having a great free conversation before the conversation. So it's good.
Sometimes that's the best part of anything, right?
That's right. So let me just 1 second here as I get my screen together and everything together, because I'm all on the wrong slides and not prepared, because we've been having such a great discussion. But anyway, so let's go ahead and kick things off. So everybody out there, welcome to the People Strategy Forum. We're a mastermind of leaders dedicated to creating those workplaces where people thrive, employers reward, and customers love. And so once again, glad to have you all on the call today. So if for any of new people out there, and we are broadcasting on the Zoom platform. So if you're on this platform, you can go ahead and ask questions and participate live. But we're also on several different platforms. We're broadcasting on Facebook, LinkedIn. We are on Twitter and YouTube and so forth. If you happen to be on one of those platforms, go ahead and just continue to leave your questions in the dialogue there. We'll get back to those and answer those later. But the Zoom platform is where we're able to interact closer with our participants. So if you want to interact closely, then join us on that platform. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get through to those through the discussion today. So we have a really exciting topic to talk about, and I know those that have joined us earlier have been listening to us talk to Lisa ahead of the time. Such a dynamic person. So first, just introductions really quick. So of course we have Sumit Singlas. Sumit is back with us. He was on hiatus there for a little bit, and so glad to have him back. Thanks, Sumit. Sumit is a HR people expert, talent expert with a long pedigree of companies working for Deloitte and Accenture and so forth in his past, and so is definitely glad to have him here and share his knowledge. My name is Sam Reeve. I am a compensation consultant, and I specialize in also talent. And so I help companies build that important infrastructure to grow their companies. And then we usually have Shar Miller, but she is not able to join us today. She is, I believe, moving, and so she's not able to join us. But she is the owner of Rocky Mountain Health Advocates, and so she's our small business advisor as we come into how to apply some of these strategies into reality. She's also has a great deal of experience in talent management and in history as an HR leader. So now to introduce our guest for today, Lisa Jackson. She is the founder of Culture Pros, and I know that, Lisa, you help many companies establish their culture, evolve their culture through a lot of different situations. In today's context, we're going to be talking about how to evolve and preserve a culture through the time of merger and acquisition. So I know that we're in a point where a lot of young companies are looking at their next step in acquiring others and being acquired. And we're going to talk about the whole journey there as we go through things. But as we get started, Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're a little bit about how you got into the culture business and your journey there.
Yeah, when I started in working in culture, it was not, that wasn't what I was doing. I was working with, at the time, a little pharmaceutical company called Merck, and they were training leaders on how to create more cross-functional collaboration. And that turned out to be kind of an important skill set for being able to shorten the drug development pipeline. So that was a very intentional leadership development program. And as my partner and I, taught that across different aspects of Merck, we started hearing this as changing our culture. And as we took that program into other companies and other clients, they were saying the same thing. And so we actually decided, oh, well, this, culture is a real need on the part of companies. It's something that's growing in attention beyond just a, let's call it, turnaround strategy, which it was more then. It was more for companies in big trouble that they would be changing their culture. And so, and this is back in the late 90s, early 2000s that this all was happening. We branded as Culture Pros around 2005, I think. And it was at that time very unique to have a full capability to take a company through a cultural change and have it, because most times companies that we were working with were thinking about change management more as a project that they had to manage its way through. So a merger, like we're going to talk about mergers today, that was something that you managed through as a project rather than understanding that it's also affecting the personality of both businesses' culture, right? So we developed a full capability of a full process and tools around what it means to change a culture, because the executives and CEOs and their direct reports were really confused about, this culture thing, it just seemed like it was kind of, oh my gosh, I don't want to deal with it. It's too fuzzy, it's too mysterious. And so that was our early days. Now culture is, every other word that you hear about business has culture in it. And it is definitely reached a level of awareness, I think, that is both healthy, but also I'm not sure that the confusion has been alleviated in a lot of cases about, or even in the case of mergers, And I'm really eager to hear both of your insights on this as well, because I'm awfully close to it. But in the case of mergers, there's just almost no attention given to culture in the due diligence stage. Bankers, lawyers, they really are not trained in that realm of the people side. They sort of, oh, that'll just take care of itself once the people merge. And it rarely does. And the reason that about 90%, up to 90% of mergers actually fail to deliver the expected results in ROI is because of people conflict. So, not contract law.
And I think that's the big thing. I think that companies merge for a lot of different reasons. And sometimes they merge to, to take out a competitor, or sometimes they merge to grow the business. And sometimes they merge because it's a great synergy between two companies that they can really take advantage and grow and take up market share in the industry. And so I think that when bankers get involved in the merger process, it's almost an afterthought, because okay, this has been decided, I've been hired, and now we're going through this process. But really, I think that so I went through the merger with between Barclays Global Investors and BlackRock in my career, and that was fascinating, because in that particular situation, they did think about culture ahead of time, and they were thinking about, because they really cared and wanted the talent, the special talent that was at Barclays Global Investors. I mean, these were a bunch of brainiacs. I mean, really skilled people in creating the iShares product, and that was something that BlackRock wanted to preserve. And so the wisdom of Larry Fink and going through this process is that he was thinking that, okay, so we need to preserve this, and so what do we have to do in going through this process? We have to include the cultural aspect and all elements of not only the bringing over the comp, which was I was involved in, but on other parts of HR and so forth. So it was a big initiative, and it was successful, because what happened is that we found that the two companies were really in alignment with one another as far as culturally, and we just needed to make some tweaks during that process, and it was very successful. But I think you're right. In most situations since then, when I've experienced clients go through cultural change or actually a merger, culture is almost they're more aware of it nowadays, but they still are focused on the mechanics that have to happen.
The deal itself. I don't know that, this is something that I think also is a interesting point about the term mergers. I'm not sure there's ever really a true merger, where you think about it as a 50-50 coming together and both sides hold equal power and stake in it. It's almost always some form of acquisition. And I think that, and I'm sure there are exceptions to that people can point out. If you do actually end up with a true merging of a 50-50, we're going to come to, each of us has equal power, each of us has equal, value that we bring to the table. It's not like I'm trying to just buy your talent or your technology. That I'd like to hear a story about that, because it's usually, there can be big behemoths like the Time Warner, acquisition of, what am I trying to remember which Time Warner, but these really big companies that are coming together. I think that is an exception more than a rule. It's usually somebody is buying someone else is what the most familiar aspect. And in that case, to me, I think this topic of culture is really, the onus is upon the seller and that point to say, if they have built a sound business strategy and they know that culture is a piece of it and that their culture is unique and it has this unique sauce or flavor to it, that it's up to you at that stage is when you have the power, is in the sell stage, not in the after the deal is closed stage. So a lot of what I preach about is, get your get your leverage in play around what you think needs to happen to integrate the people side of it before the deal is done, and identify some of those areas where there may be clashes or where there may be synergies.
Yeah. But that's interesting though. I mean, in going through several M&A situations or myself, I mean, in some as and on both sides of the equation, you know, and helping with that, and then also being, you know, being part of the employee group that is being acquired. On the employees, and I know many of our listeners out there have been through the same experience, but from the employee side, I mean, there's just a bunch of mystery. I mean, there's such secrecy, and we don't know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. It's just one day it's announced, and everybody's like going, oh, they just turn white, right? And with fear of, okay, what does this mean for us? What does it mean for the company? And am I going to be employed in a couple months from now? You know, so
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I call it the airplane on the tarmac phenomena. So if you're sitting in an airplane on a tarmac and time's ticking, right? You're sitting there and 5 minutes goes by and you're kind of like, why aren't we moving? And you just give you the line of planes outside the window and you can kind of tell. Half an hour goes by, no communication happens, you know, 45 minutes, an hour and a half goes by, nothing is said. And how are you feeling, right? The anxiety levels through the roof. Am I going to make my connection? And so to me, that's right. I understand the reasons behind why companies can't necessarily be public about the announcement or leak information, but employees know. They know that stuff's happening behind closed doors, and they are absolutely, totally 100% right, Sam. They're very anxious about whether they'll lose their job. And so then you think about this. What happens then to the most marketable talent in your company in that situation? What are they doing?
They're looking, they're brushing up their resume.
They are, and they're going to be the first ones to jump ship if the deal doesn't look good for them.
Yeah, right. And they have options.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Smith.
So losing your job is only one part of the story. So, for example, if we were discussing overseas acquisitions and overseas mergers. What if you're working in, say, a company based in Europe and you get taken over by a company in India or China? So you may not fear losing your job, but you might have certain, as an employee, you might have certain reservations about the way folks in those countries in this part of the world do business. And you might have just a lot of uncertainty thinking about who's my boss going to be, will the decision making be as autonomous as it used to be. So I think we've started talking a lot about culture without really defining any boundaries, or without really talking about what does culture mean. Is it still some kind of an intangible, the six blind men and the elephant kind of a scenario where everyone's got a different definition? Or do we have some clear guidelines on culture means how we take decisions? Culture means how we focus on the employer brand, because let's face it, I may not have any fear of losing my job tomorrow, but at the same time, I may not really want to work for a brand which I feel is getting diluted.
And so let's back up there, Lisa. And when you talk about culture with your clients, what is the context and the how you frame culture with them?
You know, that's a super good point, Sumit, that you make. And I talk about it as the drivers of performance in a business. So I'm looking at culture much more broadly than a lot of people might, or defining it much more broadly. And so just as a side note, I have been using a tool to assess culture since 2003 that has identified drivers of bottom line performance in an organization, and then those are measured as cultural strengths or weaknesses. So I've always taught culture through the lens of performance, and it is absolutely, based on really 5 habits that we come around to. One of them is clarity, your ability to achieve clarity and alignment across the organization about direction. So whether that's mission, whether that's strategy, whether that's big goals, that's number 1 is clarity. Number 2 is how well you collaborate across the business, because that turns out to define your ability to move with speed and change, especially in service of the customer. One of the third pieces that I talk about a lot is decision rights. You pointed to it, Sumit, is like, how are decisions being both made but also cascaded across the organization? Who has final decision rights? This is a huge piece in mergers, because you've got to kind of get down to with that executive team. If you're bringing in a combined executive team, you're not just acquiring talent and absorbing them, but you're actually creating a new executive team. The decision rights piece is really important. Communication is number 4, which is how well are you creating, and that's the mouthpiece, of the organization, and how well is that actually building trust in the company's brand. So that's a super important habit. And which one have I missed? I think I talk a lot about cadence, and I put these C's together, these words that most of them just fell into, like, I was kind of going, what are the 5 habits? And they all seem to be C words. And this cadence piece is really about the speed at which you're able to absorb change, internally. And because, human beings, as we know, are generally, I wouldn't say resistant to change, but we're certainly not liking it when it's forced upon us. So a lot of what I think happens in mergers is that's a massive forced change for a lot of people. They don't really get to choose. So the cadence piece is really affected. Like, you're going to have to slow down a little bit, in order to get people on the bus, where you don't just expect to keep going at 70 miles an hour down the highway, when half the people are hanging off the sides. Right. And so
Absolutely.
That's kind of how we define it. And we've done that, we've done that. And there are, there are stages, I think, that are really discrete stages in a merger that you go through with these habits, or these business practices or areas of focus that you can't shortcut. And it's kind of what we've learned along the way, that if you try to jump too fast ahead, to achieving certain synergies or performance and shortcut those stages, that's where the wheels start to come off.
Agreed. And it brings a slightly non-corporate or a non-organizational example to mind. So I spent about a year in Mongolia, so I got to understand a lot more about the conqueror Genghis Khan. And interestingly, if you compare his way of taking over the world to the way hostile takeovers happen, the interesting thing he did was, whenever he'd conquer any new area, he would leave the culture intact. So he didn't have any flags, he didn't have any coins, he didn't have any images of him hanging over people's heads. He allowed them to maintain their own art forms, their own dance forms, and he didn't really say, we have to absorb all these people. And therefore, there was barely any rebellion, even though at one point, the Mongol Empire was absolutely massive. And I think where a lot of organizations get it wrong is, the idea is we need to absorb the entity that we're acquiring. So whether you look at Google acquiring Nest, whether you look at Amazon acquiring Whole Foods, the idea has always been, we're Amazon, we're a well-oiled, efficient machine. Therefore, we've got to bring Whole Foods into the same umbrella. And that merger or acquisition, or whatever you want to call it, it failed because Whole Foods was a lot more laid back and relaxed as an organization, a lot more values driven, and therefore people just didn't fit into the Amazon scheme of things.
And I think they might have learned from that. I don't know the inner workings of that, but they bought Zappos, which is infamous in their culture. And that was an autonomous deal. I'm sure Zappos, Tony Hsieh's, rest his soul, probably insisted on that. that the autonomy be, with the culture, unique culture Zappos has built, it's world famous, and that they would be left
Absolutely.
alone. Now,
So,
and then on the other side of the continuum is Apple, which essentially buys technology talent and puts golden handcuffs on them, right, to stay 3 or 4 years. So that's literally all they're doing. They don't want your culture. They want your people.
that's true. Yeah.
So let's talk about that. I mean, the first thing, Lisa, when you were brought on as an expert, I mean, I think that the company's already decided that they want to either preserve culture in a certain way or evolve it in a certain way, right? That's why they're bringing you as an expert. So they've already decided that it means something. It's important to them in one way or another. And so, what is the first things that you do in that M&A situation? Given that after you've been hired.
So if I'm hired, I'm an outsider. By definition, that's important to them, that they have somebody who's seen as neutral. And, that's a really important element of it. So it's very difficult for the steps I'm about to describe are not rocket science, but I think it's the positioning that makes them powerful. And I'll just say also before I answer, the steps, that oftentimes in my career, probably I'd say about 70 to 80% of my work has been post-merger integration work, and it's almost always too late. So it's like 1 to 2 years have gone by, and it's a little bit like, think of the step family, right? Two people marry, they go, oh, we're in love, everything else will fall into place, and then there's just war in the household. And that's a lot harder actually to come in and provide value than if you sort of start at the outset with, this conversation agreement. So I'm just going to preface what I'm saying with that. But it does start with a cultural assessment, and I'm pretty experienced and savvy at nuances and what to look for in terms of both where there's alignment and where there's differences. So I do that through many different means. I try to customize it to what the company's goals are, where they stand with regards to that, what are they looking to accomplish from it? And most of the time it involves some level of keeping great talent, not losing our good people. So we'll do focus groups, we'll do interviews, we'll do survey assessment, I'll compile all that data. But I think the most important part of assessment is really the second step, which is where you create meaningful conversations across the business about where we do and don't agree. And it's magic, actually, when that happens. Those conversations are, again, not rocket science, but because I'm a skilled facilitator, I've been doing this for a long time, I tend to know when to poke at something, or when to kind of set it aside, or, boy, you guys are just, arguing over who gets the bigger half of the peanut butter sandwich, I'm like, let's just agree to disagree. So I think a lot of it is just mediation, in the end of the day. But then there are tools that we bring to the table where we talk about, hey, here are the phases that you guys are going through. And people love that. They like to know, hey, what step are we on, and where are we in the process, and what do we need to do next? So I think a lot of it is just bringing that external lens rather than, continuing. As we know, you will see things through your own experience. In
Right.
any situation, you will have that particular bias. And while I'm not completely unbiased, I think it's important that in building trust or rebuilding trust, that you have somebody who is viewed as unbiased in the process. So, yeah.
So that's great. I mean, we started off the conversation on just talking about the fear that happens with employees, and so basically the merger acquisition is announced. The employee group is thinking, oh geez, what's going on? What's happening next? Leadership is struggling. They're going, okay, what do we have to do? We need to, now that we've announced, we need to get our act together, and what are the next steps? They have to figure out the strategy if they haven't, because they're introducing a broader group. So it sounds like during this lull of when you have the announcement and the rest of the leadership team is getting involved on next steps, you could have a people initiative like this that really solidifies or helps people transition and go through those changes, and then gives them confidence that, hey, culture is a big deal to us. Our future of our people is a big deal.
That's the signal, Sam. I think that, and I'm not, obviously I have a bias toward this topic of culture, right? And how important it is, because I've seen over the years how organizations that tend to it fare in terms of their ability to keep great talent. And so, yeah, it's absolutely that is accurate. And also I would say, when, timing is everything, but so much of the time in that first 30 days, when a merger is announced, you have this, we talked earlier touched earlier a bit on it. You have this very small window in which your best talent are assessing whether they stay or go.
Yeah.
And and how you handle that window, and what you do during that time, I think has a lot to do with the overall long-term success of the merger. It's a very short window of opportunity. And so much of the time, what we've, as I said, I'm brought in a year or two after the fact, and now you've just got, it's a little bit like if you had a flood in your basement and you just kind of leave it there and ignore it for a couple of years, and now you've got a much bigger problem. And that's part of what I try to convey in my message, is just get out in front of it. I wrote a playbook on merging success because of this. I don't charge anything for it, because I just want people to understand how essential this is, that it's a concrete business strategy to work through the cultural elements and the merger and the people side of it. Until we have, I guess, robots running companies. These are people. We have feelings, we have emotions, we have fear, and so we've got to acknowledge that. And too much of the time, what I see is companies put out a PR campaign around the merger of how great it's going to be for people, but they don't experience that at all on a day-to-day basis. The rumor mill is way stronger than any PR that you can put out.
And it can be disingenuous if it's not approached correctly, right? Because as you just think about your employees, I mean, a lot of times the people, the person that is acquiring you as a company or whatever, they were the enemy 2 minutes ago.
Yes, exactly. We were fierce competitors. T-Mobile and Sprint merged, right? And that it was like, wait, we've just spent the last 10 years or 15 years, as enemies, and now all of a sudden we're in the same. We're in the same city, and fortunately they did actually get out in front of it. I was part of an RFP that I didn't end up working on this project, but they put an RFP out for culture due diligence before the merger. So hopefully they've created some healthy conversations around that process. But yes, it is kind of crazy. It's like, do you remember that we're human? Like, Hatfield's and McCoy's tribal warfare has been one of the most enduring concepts in humanity. So yeah, I don't think that deal makers really understand the reality of that, because they generally, I don't know, Sam, when you were did your company get acquired or was out buying other companies, so that you were at the same time you were kind of contemplating this territory, on the part of your clients? Weren't you guys at some point buying and selling your own company? Wasn't BlackRock acquired? Whoops. Is he still there? Oh, he's on mute.
Sorry, I lost my internet connection there.
Not want you muted, right? at the moment. But, so you have now kind of I just was asking the question of, have you had this personal experience of being in a company that was acquired? Either of you, Sam or Sumit?
Oh yeah. I've gone through acquisitions a few times. So yeah, definitely. I was talking to you about the journey of what that feels like and not knowing and so forth. And so I think that's a big question. But back to the point, as we were talking about, if the company that's acquiring you is a competitor, there's a feeling of great loss, if it's not handled appropriately. So one industry that thinks about competition differently is the beer industry, and so I'm in Colorado, and so the beer industry is a big deal here, but these companies are very collaborative. I mean, they're competitive against one another, but they understand that they all bring something unique to the industry, and so it's not like they're fiercely competitive. They know that they can collaborate in a lot of ways, and they all have their unique approach. But I think that's what some of these uber competitive companies are missing out of. I mean, if you label your competitor as almost evil, and that or you have this stress between the two companies. I mean, it's going to be horrible for people when they come together, unless you start kind of narrowing the gap ahead of time.
But no doubt.
So when you're hired and you're coming into situations with a particular firm, is this something that you assess before you take on the project?
Yeah, absolutely. I had to that point, I had an example of an organization that contacted me that was they were related to Amazon. They weren't being bought by Amazon, but they were sort of in a business that, sold through Amazon. And they were a really small but mighty force in their space, and they were the cash rich of the two companies, right, that were competitors, direct competitors in this space. And the one with the money bought the other that was bigger, right? So this one was bigger, we had all the money, we bought you. And I wasn't sure that I could help them, because there was such animosity between the two different organizations. And the woman who had contacted me, on the buy side, she was like, I'm just terrified of how this is going to go, because there's been such animosity internally between us for so long. And I checked in with her. I never actually ended up engaging with this client, but I just kept in touch with her, because I felt for her, and what that was like. And, her, I don't know, a few hundred employees on her side, what she was seeing happen. And she just said, it's a mess. We're going to start losing lots and lots of good people here any day now. So yeah, I think that I really like what you're saying, Sam, about the collaboration piece. As I mentioned at the beginning, I grew up with that as my core belief and skill set around what happens when you can get people collaborating across these artificial lines and new ideas coming to the table. And especially, we were talking before we even started today about Sumit saying, you've got Indian companies acquiring American companies. There's got to be some form of collaboration there in order for that to overcome the fear. And it always does. I've seen it over and over and over. If you ask people to participate, if you ask them to get their fingerprints on it, if you sit in a room together with people from enemy camps, right? And, with a few exceptions, depending on the circumstances, you're going to these are people. Right? It's like you start to realize this person that I thought was an enemy, it was like an enemy in my mind. And then you sit in a room with them and you brainstorm and you look at that person, you're like, that was a great idea. It breaks down those barriers. So I agree with you, Sam, on the collaboration part. I wasn't aware of that specifically, calling that out in the beer industry here in Colorado. I think that's very cool to hear that.
Yeah, I think, and I think that when we're looking at, you were talking about people starting to come together at the first time and as competitors, and often the behavior that I see over and over again is the two groups come together and they're always saying, well, my way is the best way, or my way is the best way, and I think there needs to be some sort of almost a guidance in that relationship, and saying, okay, well, let's look at the how we do things, and let's take the best of both methods, and
Yeah.
need some guidance there. So do you help with those kind of conversations?
Absolutely. That's one of the most important aspects, I think, is and it's in this playbook that I mentioned, is we've got, what's your culture strategy? Is it best of both? Is it one's going to absorb the other, or is it that we're going to create really a cultural transformation all the way across, through this coming together? And so, yeah, that's one of the first things I do up front if I'm working with a company, is to understand what's the culture strategy here. Are we going to, how are we going to go about this? So getting both sides to get closer to at least the same page on that, very, 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 very critical, to understand the goal before you even start assessing, because those lenses change depending on what they're looking to do. But I think the best of both is great. I think there are real times when both need a cultural transformation. So I wasn't actually involved in this particular merger, but you mentioned the beer industry. I knew about two companies that one was being bought by the other, and they used it literally as an opportunity to improve and up-level culture and get more professionalism, in play with regards to the culture, and have it be less casual or informal.
Mm-hmm. So as we dive into your playbook a little bit more, I mean, we talked about helping or looking at the merger and acquisition climate at the beginning. What is the real true intent of these companies coming together? Are they valuing talent? Do they want to preserve talent? Is this and then the next is we discussed about those two teams coming together and starting to interface with one another. What should leadership be doing during these pieces that we've been talking about? Listening.
That's what leaders should be doing. Asking a lot of questions and listening.
Mm-hmm. And what's the
I
best
don't want to
example?
be.
What's the best example that you've seen of that?
Well, I'm sorry to be just a little bit at a loss for words. That rarely happens, but I don't see it enough. And that's part of the problem, is that oftentimes they'll pay lip service to listening, but then they do nothing with the data. So the best examples I've seen of it is we've been inside and trained them on the business case for it, that where we have had that effect. And I could cite multiple examples of that over the years, where we've been inside an organization where that listening process really brought forth. Even so, I mentioned that, I don't know if I mentioned this, where there was a company we worked with that was it was sort of North Carolina, which is the South. Mm-hmm. in the United States, right? Officially, they would call themselves the South, even though I think, are they above the Mason-Dixon line? I think they're right on the border there. So North Carolina manufacturing industry bought a New York related industry player, right? So this is a growth strategy. And the idea was that they were going to leave that New York company pretty autonomous, but that the leader, the CEO of that company, needed to be part of this executive team. And the two CEOs never saw eye to eye. They were 100% 180-degree different. We coached them. We coached the team. We did, multiple rounds of these listening sessions. And I saw the benefits in the organization's employees there. So they felt like, oh, there's a culture consultant here. So this means we actually care about people. They got a lot of mileage out of that, and a lot of people benefited. But in the end, the two CEOs never got on the same page. They were constantly at each other's throats. And it wasn't for lack of trying. It was just a real mismatch there in terms of their vision and their understanding for how they were going to operate. And so in the end, really what had to happen was both the CEOs ended up leaving those two companies in the end. And I think that was the biggest peace move for the company was that sometimes the leadership itself is the biggest barrier. So when I talk about examples of listening, it depends on where you are in your life in that skill set. So I think if you're I'm just going to say this plainly, if you're a legacy CEO that's more my generation, you have not been raised and taught with that as much as if you are, say, a younger millennial, that was raised with the core value of collaboration and being heard at the dinner table. And so I think the best examples of listening come from leaders who understand and have practiced throughout their life the value of listening and collaboration, for sure. But
Right.
it's still something where we almost always want to be heard more than we want to listen to others. Right. So it takes skill, it takes discipline and practice.
So Sumit, I'd like to hear from your experience and what you're seeing in outside the U.S. and in other countries, as far as some of the the biggest problems that you see with talent and mergers and acquisitions, and I'd like to compare that with Lisa's experience. So what are you seeing, Sumit? What are the biggest issues that you see?
So I think one of the biggest issues that I see, Sam, is the fact that our communication isn't really tuned to the stakeholders. So if you're talking about a tech company merging with another or being acquired by another, as a programmer, I don't really care about what the global footprint of the organization is going to be, or whether you've got 20 locations or 50 locations around the world and stuff like that. What I care about is, what does it mean for me? Do I have more career opportunities? Is my job secure? Will I get faster promotions? Do I get more money at the end of the month? And questions like that. So one of the things that we did, the example I was quoting, where I was handling the culture part of the Indian company acquiring two firms in the US, was that we started with thinking about the cultural integration before the merger actually began. So at the due diligence stage itself, tried looking at various kinds of policies, how decisions happen, what kind of benefits are available to people, what is the career architecture, what's the talent mobility scenario in all the three different organizations, and what are some things that we can proactively, right from day one after the press release goes out, how can we start communicating with people where we're not just saying this is phenomenal, this is brilliant, and you should all be on board. Also, because the context in this part of the world is, when you do decide to switch jobs, it's fairly regular to get you'd be a really poor negotiator if you got a less than 15% salary increase. So even if you're going in for the same job to a different company, the trend is you should be getting a 20% salary hike. Otherwise, you're just a really, really poor negotiator. So by the time an employee has already started thinking on those lines, even if you promise them the world, they're seeing more money already. So reversing the decision is not going to happen. So therefore, here what we did was we created the external communications separately, the press release and other artifacts for communicating with vendors, partners, the external world. Created employee-centric communication where I recommended to the client that you should start talking about things like job opportunities and internal job postings right from day two or day one itself, and say that as the CHRO, I'm pleased to introduce you to a world of opportunities that we've opened up. These are some of the open roles across the world, and we invite all of you to apply for them, refer your friends and family, and so on and so forth. Also, started conducting sessions to hear what their concerns were, identified various culture champions who were relatively influential people who would be listened to, and got them to communicate all the pros and cons, and didn't really shy away from communicating that, yes, these are certain things we will have to do differently. So it's not all that's a rosy picture. There are things that will change. There are things that we will need to deal with on a day-to-day basis, which you might have been used to, but being a larger entity, there's going to be more structure, more discipline, less spontaneous decision-making, and so on and so forth. And scheduling regular sessions just to listen to people and also act on them. So plan for meetings to listen in and also follow-up meetings where the leader would have to definitely come back with a list of things that I heard these 5 issues. I've been able to take action on, say, 1, 2, or 3 of them, and 2 are still things that I'm working on, but I can assure you of a response by this date and so on. So I'm proud to say that instead of people leaving, we were able to attract a higher number of people to the organization, and they were actually able to fill roles much faster than they'd anticipated.
That's great.
That's something there I wanted to just point out and kind of cement in that story that I think is very important, to mark out and very real. And that is that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And that this idea that change is not going to happen is a fallacy. But if you tell them up front that there will be changes and that you'll have a voice, but in the end, someone else's, these decisions are going to be made. And I think, you might lose a few people who just can't live with it, but for the most part, that's honest. That's just being honest. That's not nothing's going to change or everything's going to be the same as not honest.
Right. Well, it's such an important conversation, as we're talking about the culture and preserving it through the M&A process. But we are reaching the top of the hour here, so I do want to.
Oh, that went fast.
I know, it does. I mean, especially this, this is. I think that mergers and acquisitions happen at such an increasing rate that I think all of our listeners have been impacted in one way or another. I would imagine. And so knowing how, and I know that we've all seen how this has gone wrong. I mean, I've gone through several, and I've been fortunate enough to see what it's like when it's done right. And fortunately, those were early in my career, and then when I was part of companies later in my career before I started doing my own thing. I went through some mergers that were just not well thought out, and realized that, hey, it can go wrong. It's good to have experts and so forth. So I'm glad that you're out there, Lisa, providing guidance on this, and Sunit, of course, in India and so forth. So anyway, to acknowledge our sponsor, I want to talk about TMA and the importance of this particular tool. TMA is a tool that is used to get to know your people better. It's an assessment, like many assessments are out there, but the important thing about the TMA method is it's based on positive psychology. There's not a element in here that's going to say that you're bad for this job or whatever. It's based on your preferences and how your people want to work and how they want to show up and how they provide their best work. So if you're interested in learning more about the TMA method, I encourage you to reach out to me, and I'll set you up with a free assessment so you can learn a little bit more about that. I also want to talk about our speaker next week. We are having Anissa. She's going to be joining us, and she's going to be talking about the modernization of talent management, how we need to look at talent management nowadays, given the shifts that we're seeing in the marketplace. We've all know about the Great Resignation that's going on across the globe, and the pandemic has changed a lot of the ways that we're looking at the HR practice and how we're applying that to talent. So join us to hear more about Anissa's approach onto this. I'm really excited. She has a book that out there it's a fun read. It's a fictional book about how a company is navigating this change. And so come to learn more about that next week. Well, great. So as we wrap up here, Lisa, let's see if we have any. Did I miss any questions that we didn't address in the chat?
But people are asking for the link to the Merging Success Playbook. I mentioned that it is, and I popped it in the chat, but for people that are not in the Zoom, you can feel free to, if you want to and have a way to share that to the broader audience, Sam.
Okay, great. And so let's just talk about that. I mean, for those that are listening in on this conversation, how can they contact you and learn more about what you do, Lisa?
Well, thank you. So probably the easiest way is to go to corporateculturepros.com.
Mhm.
That's my website. And on there is, if you scroll around off the homepage or you go to services, you'll see mergers as our prominent service that we offer. And that's going to get you access, to the link for the playbook. You do have to sign up with an email address so that we can keep in touch with you on the subject and send you a little bit more information. You can also go to our YouTube channel, Corporate Culture Pros there, and we have a whole series of videos on merging success. So check it out and enjoy
Great, perfect.
the research, because it's a rich territory. And I think that the culture part of merging is the ripe opportunity. Sumit referred to, or you referred to, the Great Resignation. And this is, I think, more than just people quitting. I actually think that it is a shift in the belief system on the part of employees about their power.
Yeah.
And so what that is going to shift the dynamics in the workplace forever, where people will just not be putting up with bad employment situations any longer.
Right. Great. Well, a wonderful conversation, Lisa. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to be back. I've been missing all of you and enjoyed today's conversation very much.
We'll have to have you on again soon.
Yeah, that sounds good. I hope it's been helpful to a few people. I always like it when people get a nugget or two out of whatever we've been talking about. So hopefully that was the case today.
Great. All right. Well, everybody have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Sam. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.